Hello guys, so we're going to continue our discussion of sectionalism and causes leading up to the Civil War, differences between the North and South. So we left off talking about the Missouri Compromise, and as you can see, this map represents the Missouri Compromise. After the Missouri Compromise was in, I'm going to write M-O, Compromise, was in 1820, okay, and that added Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state, and also made a rule for future generations that the bottom of Missouri right here is called the 3630 latitude line, okay? And any new territory that's going to be added as states above that line had to be free, meaning that all this unorganized stuff up here is going to be free territory, and all this unorganized stuff down here is going to be open to slavery, okay? So that is the Missouri Compromise. And as America is gaining new territory and more people move to that territory, they want it to become a state. And when it becomes a state, it has to decide, is it going to be a slave state or a free state? Because they send representatives to Washington, D.C. right here, and they're going to debate laws in Congress. So this will come to a head with the Mexican War in 1848. So before the Mexican War, I'm going to erase some of this stuff. This belonged to Mexico. All of this belonged to Mexico. And there was disputed territory around Texas and here. Texas decided to break away from Mexico, and it wanted to be its own country, its own little baby country, the Republic of Texas. But Mexico still owned all this. And we're not going to go really deep into the war, but in 1848, that Mexican War ends. And the treaty was signed. The treaty was called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And the U.S. gets so much land from Mexico. So all of these southwestern states, present-day states, was territory that America gained, and it wasn't a state yet. Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Utah, all of that. And remember, under this law, the line, everything below that line needs to be slave territory or slave states, and everything above it has to be free territory or free states. So Americans want to move out west, especially farmers, because we're running out of room to grow those cash crops in the South. But are they allowed to take their slaves with them? And what about representation in Congress? We want to keep it equal to where there's an equal number of senators that represent slave states and an equal number of senators that represent free states. So when Texas is added, and here's Texas added to the United States, it kind of looks a little bit funky. And then the United States owns all this stuff, but it's not states yet. And that's right after the Mexican War in 1848 when that ends. So the idea is that everything below that line is going to be slave territory and everything above it is going to be free territory. But that's not what happens. We get into a little bit of a contentious issue here. Another issue is a bunch of people are leaving over here and going to California in what's known as the California Gold Rush. And the Gold Rush happens at the same time the Mexican War ends. It's like 1848, 1849. And so California in 1 year has enough people to become a state. So we've got some issues here. We've got all this new territory. We've got California wants to be a new state. We've got Texas wants to be a new state, but it has all this territory above that 3630 line. So what are we going to do? And what we put together is known as the Compromise of 1850. It's a huge historical event because of everyone moving out west and everyone wanting their territory to become a state. California applies for statehood, and it wants to be a free state. Well, let's go back to our map. Remember, everything below this line is supposed to be open to slavery. Well, part of California is below that line, but part of it's above. So what do? They want to be a free state, and a large debate ensued in Congress. And actually, a man from Kentucky, his name is Henry Clay. He's from Lexington. He kind of put together this compromise. I'll give up this, you give up this. Let's put together one big old law again. And here's the Compromise of 1850. A compromise was passed where California equals a free state. Okay? New Mexico and the Utah territories were going to be popular sovereignty. And here's what popular sovereignty means. Popular means what's popular. And sovereignty means is what's going to be the law. So what's popular is going to be the law. Now, how do we decide what's popular? We vote, the vote of the residents of that territory. So those people are going to vote when they want to become a state. Are they going to be a slave state or a free state? They also wanted to give, it's a compromise, right? You have to give up some things, and the North needed to give a little bit more to the South. So they imposed the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act is exactly what it sounds like. Fugitive slaves who escape, must be returned back to their masters down south. So being an escaped slave on the Underground Railroad and making it to the North, you're not just automatically safe. They lived in constant fear of being captured again and taken back down to the South. And we got rid of the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Not slavery itself, but slave auctions weren't allowed to be held in Washington, D.C. Okay, so here's the Compromise of 1850. It's all together now. California is added as a free state. California is added as a free state. Utah and New Mexico right here are going to be decided by popular sovereignty. And then Texas kind of like gets a better defined boundary there. That was part of it. And then the fugitive slave law, saying that fugitive slaves have to be returned back down to the South if they are caught by people in the North. Okay? So that's the Compromise of 1850. So the Compromise of 1820, remember the Missouri Compromise, lasted for about 30 years until we needed another one, the Compromise of 1850. So there are some effects of this compromise. The Fugitive Slave Act made it a federal crime to help runaways, so the Underground Railroad is now illegal, and it allowed the arrest of escaped slaves. And the Northerners, when they learn about this fugitive slave, like they are enraged because they don't want to be implicated in helping along with slavery. They don't want to help the South continue to own people and own slaves. In addition to this, what we saw in our video is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a book written about slavery, and it just shows the horrors. Families being broken up at slave auctions, people being treated like animals, people being beaten, people being worked to death. And so Uncle Tom's Cabin added to those tensions because Northerners read that book and thought slavery really is evil and cruel. Now, the Compromise of 1850, it worked in a sense that it worked for 10 years. For about 10 more years, tensions and the Civil War was held off, but it was coming to a head no matter what. So remember when everybody was worried about Missouri wanting to become a state? What do? Okay, we had to broker this big compromise called the Missouri Compromise. Now Kansas does the same thing. So there's an idea that a railroad should go from the east, think like New York City and Chicago area, and go all the way out west to California. And part of that is going to go through Kansas. So there's a proposal for this big railroad to connect California to everywhere else. And in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Stephen Douglas, he's a senator that you need to remember his name because he'll be important later. He wanted Kansas and Nebraska to vote whether or not they wanted to be a slave or free state. So let's take a look at Kansas and Nebraska. Remember, we have that 3630 line right here. And here's Kansas, and it's going to be broken up into a state that kind of looks like this. And here's Nebraska, and it's going to be broken up into a state that kind of looks like this. And he wanted Kansas and Nebraska to be able to decide whether or not they wanted slavery. He wanted them to decide based on popular sovereignty. What is popular will be sovereign. But look, they are above the line. Above this line is supposed to be new free states. States that become states after 1820 are supposed to be free, not slave. But he wants them to be able to vote. So that would drop the Missouri Compromise. And those places would be added by popular sovereignty. Well, this sets off a huge ordeal where Kansas turns into a mini civil war. So once it's organized, Kansas is like, we want to become a state. Just hell breaks loose in Kansas. The issue of slavery becomes a hot topic. There are pro-slavery people and anti-slavery people that literally fight and kill each other within Kansas. People would sneak in that didn't live in Kansas and vote for either side. They were called border ruffians. Large numbers of small battles occurred, including a battle called Pottawatomie Massacre, where John Brown, we'll remember his name from later, we'll learn his name later, fought and killed people who were pro-slavery, and anti-slavery people were pro-slavery people were fighting back. And so this whole little mini civil war in Kansas is called Bleeding Kansas. And the issue is just not resolved. At one point, there were two capital cities in Kansas, and one was pro-slavery and one was anti-slavery, and they hated each other. So Kansas and Nebraska becomes a national issue. Here's two quotes. "We are playing for a mighty stake. If we win, we carry slavery to the Pacific Ocean. If we fail, we lose all the territory." So this is from the perspective of a pro-slavery person who wants Kansas to vote pro-slavery. The next one says, "We will engage in competition for the virgin soil of Kansas. God gave the victory to the side which is stronger in numbers as it is in right." So he's saying we're right in being anti-slavery. So this is the perspective of an anti-slavery person. So the issue thickens. So Kansas and Nebraska is in 1854. In 1857, an even bigger issue comes to light. What if a slave owner takes a slave to a free territory? Is that person free because they now live in a free territory? Can you take slaves wherever you want? So this issue comes to light in a Supreme Court case called Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. So Dred Scott, he is a slave. He sued for his freedom. He went to the government and said, "I'm suing this person, my former master." It was a family, and the husband had died, and it was the wife. Because he said that he had moved with his master and lived in free areas that slavery wasn't allowed, and thus he should have been freed. So he was saying, "I'm free because my master took me to a free area. I shouldn't have been enslaved anymore." And the court ruled against Dred Scott, okay? And so they said, basically, if you're a slave, you can be taken anywhere. Those are the rules. And here's the court's reasoning. Dred Scott, and this is what they wrote, okay? They said that Dred Scott and any person who is a slave is not a citizen. So slaves are not citizens, so they can't be sued. They can't sue in court. They can't have a lawyer. They can't be in the courtroom, those sort of things. Basically saying you're not a citizen of the United States. You're a slave, and that's all. They also wrote that slaves were property. And so property can be taken anywhere. If a person moves, they move their bed and their quilts and their chairs and their brooms and their suitcases. Well, slaves were not citizens. They were barely considered humans. They were considered property. And so they can be taken anywhere. And that meant that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories, which is a major blow, right? All the anti-slavery people were so upset about this because it basically said that slaves can be taken anywhere and there's no free versus slave. They're just property and they can be taken anywhere. And that created a huge, huge divide between pro-slavery and anti-slavery people even further, a huge divide between the North and the South. And we're getting closer and closer to 1860, which is when the Civil War starts. So the implications, the effects of Dred Scott is that it was seen as an attempt to spread slavery, saying Congress can't do anything about it, so now slavery can be anywhere. It strengthened Northern resolve. Northerners were even more upset. First, the Compromise of 1850, then Uncle Tom's Cabin, and now this. Slavery is bad. Why can't the government do something about it? And then it just set that divide between North and South opinions even more. So, all of this comes to a head in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln is elected president. But first, let's learn a little bit about him. He was born in 1809 in Hodgensville, Kentucky. So that is about 2 hours from here. And he was raised in a poor family. His family lived in a slave state, but they had no slaves. Then they moved to Illinois, which was a free state. And they moved around. They went to Indiana, Illinois, they were in Ohio for a while, and then eventually he ended up in Illinois. He was involved in politics pretty early. He worked tons of different jobs as a shopkeeper for a long time. Then he learned law and taught himself how to read and write, read law books, put himself through law school, those sort of things. He was elected as a state representative in Illinois. So within the state of Illinois, he was a representative, not in Washington, D.C. He was elected as a senator to Congress one time, and then he came back home and was a lawyer in Illinois. And so he doesn't really have that much of a political career, but he does run for president in 1860. Here are some of his early views. Before the Civil War, this is kind of what he believes. He says that Congress can regulate slavery in the territories, but ending slavery is a state right. So if a state is a free or slave state, then they get to decide that. But territories that want to be states, Congress can do something about it. He said that ending slavery in the nation's capital would be good through emancipation, compensated emancipation, so paying to free slaves. He was also a free soiler. I'm going to write this down. Free soiler meant that he believed that all new states should be free. Meaning that the new soil that's brought into the United States, the new land, should be free, in the hopes that eventually slavery will just kind of like be eradicated. It'll kind of go away. So he's not morally against slavery in the beginning, but he will be. He sees slavery as a division that needs to be taken care of, a threat to democracy. He sees it as what's going to tear us apart, and he's right. So Lincoln comes back and is going to try and become nationally prominent. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Lincoln decides, I don't want to be a lawyer anymore. I want to join politics. I want to try and run again for state senate or federal senate. So in 1858, Lincoln opposed Stephen Douglas, who was seeking re-election as Illinois' federal senator. So Stephen Douglas was the guy that put together the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and they're going to have an argument about it. Douglas was well known. He had helped with the Missouri Compromise and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And there are 7 debates around Illinois where they meet in different cities and debate publicly about slavery. And they're called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And there's Stephen Douglas and there's Abraham Lincoln on the left. So what are their opinions on slavery and these things? Because slavery is like the hot topic when everyone who's running for office is talking about slavery. Stephen Douglas has no moral issue against slavery. He doesn't really care about it. He doesn't think it's technically bad. And he accused Lincoln of being too wishy-washy. Whereas Lincoln, at this point, is against slavery, but he's not an abolitionist. He's like, slavery is wrong, but does the government have the right to end it? Probably not. So you see how that kind of sounds wishy-washy? He was afraid that if slaves were immediately freed, then they wouldn't be able to live amongst everyone and they would be mistreated. He didn't want slavery to be expanded. That's called free soil, remember? Let's not make any new slave states. But that doesn't mean that he wanted to eradicate it. He wasn't an abolitionist. So, Lincoln gives a very famous speech called the House Divided speech, and this is where he kind of says, this is the issue that's going to tear us apart. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. So he's saying, right now, we are North versus South, slave versus free. Eventually, one is going to take over everything. We're going to have to fight this out, essentially, is what he's saying. So Lincoln doesn't like popular sovereignty. He doesn't even want them to be able to vote to extend slavery. He doesn't like the Dred Scott decision. He doesn't like what they've said about African Americans. He doesn't want slavery to be expanded, but he knows there's going to be a fight to end it. Douglas's idea is called the Freeport Doctrine. Freeport Doctrine is another speech that the other guy, Stephen Douglas, gave. His goal was to make Lincoln appear radical. He wanted Lincoln to look like an abolitionist. He wanted Lincoln to look like he believed that blacks and whites were equal, which Lincoln didn't believe at the time. So he insisted that slavery is a local thing, so only local governments should deal with it. Lincoln tried to in the Freeport Doctrine, tried to get Stephen Douglas to talk about popular sovereignty because that was his thing. That was his thing, that you were able to vote to allow slavery. He came up with that idea. Douglas claimed that those in territories could say slavery is not allowed by refusing to pass laws allowing it. So Southerners saw that as, oh, we thought we were voting for this guy because he's a slavery guy. But he kind of like muddled it up a little bit there. Moving on, in 1859, we actually saw this in our video, our America, the Story of Us. We have another big slave versus free event. a man named John Brown, he's an anti-slavery extremist, went to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, a federal arsenal. An arsenal is where weapons are kept, okay? Where like the U.S. military keeps their weapons. So him and 18 others, including his 5 sons, went to this arsenal, and their plan was to take the arsenal, take the weapons, pass them out amongst slaves, and lead this huge slave revolt where slaves would rise up against their owners, kill them, and then be free. That didn't happen. No slaves actually showed up. There was no big uprising. Brown surrendered. He was caught. His sons died. He was found guilty and executed. And Southerners see this as fearful, that they would not be able to live safely in the Union. They saw this as an attack. He was seen as a traitor in the South, but a martyr, someone who died for a good cause in the North. So there's a huge divide, again, between North and South. And then the election of 1860. And as you can see, Abraham Lincoln will win. He is the Republican. But as you can also see, there's not a giant amount of red on this map. It was a very close race. So here are the states that Lincoln got. And then we had some independent votes here. And the Southern Democratic, Breckinridge, he's actually from Kentucky, won these green states. But the issue here is that Lincoln won the election with 0 electoral votes from the South. So here's the South, right? There's 0 red down here. Lincoln got none of these electoral votes, and he still won. That's because there were more electoral votes in these states because there were more people. So the South is super angry about that. Northern and Southern Democrats are divided. We've got Stephen Douglas running. We've got John Breckinridge. Republicans nominate Lincoln. There's a 4th party, the Constitutional Union Party. But the result is Lincoln wins most of the northern states. He won the Electoral College based off of the other 3. And Lincoln won none of the southern states, but was still able to win the whole thing. And so the South was upset. A week after this 1860 election, South Carolina is the first state to secede. Their legislature meets. They pass a resolution saying we're no longer part of the United States of America. And guess who followed them? Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas also said we will be leaving the Union. State legislatures passed secession, not a popular vote by the people. So representatives in that state went to their capital in that state and decided to leave. And the people weren't asked. There was no vote. So some Northerners were like, okay, bye. See you later. Some Northerners were upset because it's the dissolution of the United States. We're supposed to all be together. So as you can see, South Carolina is the first to go, followed by all of these like peachy states. Next were the orange states. And then these pink states are pretty important right here. You see the pink? Pink states are states that have slaves but did not secede from the Union. And guess whose state is right there? Kentucky's. So the pink states were really essential because they were strange slave states that stayed with the North. So they're kind of an outlier. So the South secedes and starts the Confederate States of America. In 1861, all those states meet together in Alabama. They form a new nation called the Confederate States of America. They write a new constitution. They have a new president. His name is Jefferson Davis, and he is from Kentucky. So both presidents, Lincoln and Davis, were from Kentucky. And Lincoln comes, he is inaugurated. 7 states have left the Union. More are about to leave. And he says in his inaugural address, we need to preserve the Union. We need to get them back together with us. And he promises not to end slavery. Now, we know that's not how it pans out, but he says if that's what it takes to get you back into the nation, we will not end slavery. All right, we will continue with the beginning of the Civil War in our next lecture.